Now we can take some look at some Impressionist works. And we're going to start out with the man who's considered the father of Impressionism. And this, of course, is Claude Monet. And, you had Manet, now you have Monet. Sorry. And to make it even worse, guess what? Manet becomes an Impressionist later in his life. Uh-oh. So sorry, but that's going to be a little something you're going to have to deal with, right? Manet, Monet. This is Claude Monet and his famous work, Impression Sunrise. This is considered the first Impressionist work that was created when it was shown at what was called the Salon des Indépendants. The Salon des Indépendants, or the Independent Salon, is like the Impressionist answer to the Salon des Refusés, or the Salon of the Refused. It's them basically finding a space or creating a space for themselves. Because after Monet is sort of jilted by the critics, oh, these look like impressions, this isn't good artwork, he realizes that he and his people need a safe space, right, for their pieces. So they begin to show them in the Salon des Indépendants. But in the papers, right, the art papers of the time, this was really singled out as like the first Impressionist piece that was created. And it is what it is. It's called Impression Sunrise, this idea of you're seeing an impression of the sunrise happening. Critics were appalled by this work. Again, they couldn't say enough about how it was an unfinished piece. It's a sketch. It's an impression. It's not anything fully formulated. And of course, Monet was like, I love this idea that we're seeing the momentary slip past us, We're seeing the moments, right, sort of slip past into time. And he said that my style complements that. My style complements this idea of how can you lock a second of time into place? You can't. So in a sense, all time becomes in flux. All time, becomes something that can't be set into concrete. And so you get these splishes and splashes and splooshes of paint that allude to something, but again, don't fully recognize it. So he, again, he was very happy about his practice. I always love, using Monet as, if you've ever seen the movie Clueless, one of my favorite movies, where, a character's asking another character, like, hey, is that girl pretty? And Cher says, no, she's a full-on Monet. And, it looks good far away, but up close, it's a big old mess. So, Impressionism is about, I think, holding the painting at arm's length, because if you're holding it at arm's length, the optics and the color, everything kind of works together to make the situation work. But if you zoom in on it, right, you lose the coherence or the cohesion. Go back to the compare and contrast of the Oath of the Horatii and this painting. You can zoom in on the Oath of the Horatii all day long. You're just going to get down to like seeing a toe or a buckle or something like that. But, you zoom in on this painting, you just get these like drabs and drips and dots of paint where you would be like, what am I looking at? What am I seeing? But again, I think for Monet, he was like, that's the point. The point is to say that, there is no coherence in the universe. Everything's sliding and slipping past you. Let's acknowledge the truth of that rather than saying we can freeze a moment in time, right? And he was very interested in using settings or places or things as vehicles for investigation. So when I talk about his works, I always remind my students, he wasn't obsessed with the Rouen Cathedral, in principle. Although it may look like it because he painted it over and over and over and over and over, and you get the point over and over again. He painted it over and over and over and over. So one might say, was he really obsessed with religion? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, that's the old way of thinking about art history. Here, the Rouen Cathedral is a vehicle for investigation. He wants to think about what it looks like in the snow. What does it look like in the rain? What does it look like in bright sunlight? What does it look like in the morning? What does it look, you get my point. The sunset, etc., etc., etc. So he would paint it over and over again. This really fully hit me when I went to France about 10 years ago now. And part of my tour was, a riverboat cruise. And we went to the town of Rouen, which is a gorgeous city. It's got these old timber buildings, really beautiful. We were there during Christmas time, drinking our mulled wine. It was fantastic. And we went on one of these little included tours that came with our, our trip, basically. And we walked to the town square of Rouen. And we're standing there looking at the church, this church. And the tour guide says, and if you turn around, look behind you, so we all turn around, and he points to this very innocuous, everyday looking building and says, if you look at this building here, that's where Monet kept apartments. And it hit me like a steam train, right? Where I was like, oh, well, no wonder he painted the damn cathedral so many times. He lived across the street from it. So as an impressionist, if you're looking for easy, accessible subject matter and you don't even want to get out of your pajamas, all he had to do was position his easel right at the window and look at the damn cathedral. It's like, so I'm standing there going, well, damn. And my husband's like, what? And I'm like, this explains a lot about Monet, in my mind at least. So, again, I was just struck by, he goes with convenient things because, again, he views subject matter as a vehicle for investigation. He doesn't have like a big personal tie to this church, right? Same with his haystacks. People talk about his haystack series, like all these haystacks he painted. And again, I'm always like, excuse me. I'm always like, it's not really about the haystacks. It's about them as a vehicle for investigation, right? A vehicle for something, for him to look at the different light effects, the different environmental effects, right, over the course of time. And that's why he was interested in the haystacks. Excuse me. It just, again, is about using something that can be the focal point for light, color, optics. That's all that he was really interested in these things for. So you'll notice that Monet, his work is about process. It's about technique. It's about this sense of, what you're doing with the paint, how you're working with the paint. It's not subject oriented, right? It's very different from that. This is another Monet that shows him looking at a street scene. And again, I think more so he's kind of contemplating what do the busy streets of Paris really look like, right? With the energy of people moving about, right? That flaneur spirit. That's what he's kind of thinking about here. And you notice if you try to zoom in, the figures are just these blips and blops of paint. It's all suggested to you. Your mind has to make the inference, right? It has to take the impression and give it value and give it weight. So again, he works through these different kinds of subjects, but again, I'm always thinking he's considering technique, he's considering color, light, optics. He's not really getting too overwhelmed by subject matter at the end of the day. So I always say he's using subjects as vehicles for experimentation. Then you can look at someone like Auguste Renoir, who I think is a good foil to Monet, because Renoir absolutely was more interested in the goings-on in the city, right, in Paris. Because let's face it, Impressionism is really it's a French movement. It's a Parisian movement. So Renoir was a much more social guy, and he tended to actually paint his social circle. So if you look at a lot of his paintings, like his fiancés in them, or his, friends are in them, he tended to focus on the models that were available to him, which was the people he hung out with and spent time with. He takes us to the bourgeois places that these people went to. In this case, we're at the Moulin de la Galette. A moulin was like a dance hall at the time. It was a place where people went to hang out, to dance, to drink, right? And the Moulin de la Galette was kind of set in this garden. So it was more of a daytime place than a nighttime place. Although you'll notice that electricity has recently been invented, so you'll see the hanging lights and the different light poles and different types of things throughout the scene. But again, we're catching these people kind of out in the garden, right, during the daytime. And I love how this can read within an Impressionist piece, where you have the dappling of the light, the movement of the branches kind of all inferred, right, the idea of the action and the motion of these people. Like if you look at the gentleman's jacket who's closest to us, where he has these kind of dabs of lighter color paint, that another painter like David probably would have been like, well, blend that, man, blend it, But here it's an Impressionist work. So again, our eyes infer through the optics that that's supposed to be like the sun dappling across his coat. We kind of read it that way. If we spend too much time thinking about it, of course, he starts to look like a leopard or something. But again, we're supposed to be momentarily glancing over this painting and mixing the colors and, letting the painting take us where it will. And I love this sense of stopped motion, that if you put the painting back into motion, people are swooping in to say hello, they're dancing. It's a social butterfly painting. So Renoir takes us into the bourgeois life. He takes us into what these people did and shows us, like, look, this is this is the socialization of these Impressionist people. Again, as I mentioned, not too deep, kind of shallow, but it speaks to the truth of what Renoir was trying to investigate. And he loved painting social situations. Renoir really, that's where he centered his subjects. He would love Flanders and this kind of idea. This is the painting of the woman in the loge. A loge is a theater box. So if you go to the theater, you'll notice those boxes that are kind of elevated off the floor. And usually it's like maybe a couple or two is in there. They're considered more private, right? Obviously, they're more expensive. So we're looking at bourgeois people who have money here again, going out to the theater. What I love about this work is she's accompanied by this man, but you'll notice that the man is looking elsewhere. He's using his theater glasses to look somewhere else, or his opera glasses to look somewhere else. And she's looking at us as the viewer, and she's holding her theater glasses or her opera glasses in her hand. So again, I mentioned that a lot of Impressionism is about who is looking at who is seeing and being seen. And I think this painting does a good job of encapsulating the culture of seeing and being seen. It's not just about the impressionistic technique of paint on canvas, it's also about, again, the embedded subjects that they were using as well. You can also look at Mary Cassatt, and I personally love to talk about Cassatt because she's a female painter, and she strove to make herself, a key part of the Impressionist group. It was said that she was very good friends with Monet, and so kind of, used her friendship with him to kind of, solidify herself within the group and operate from that position. These are two of her works, Lydia in the Loge and At the Opera. Women, by the way, as painters, usually had to use subjects available to them. So they often used their families. You'll see people like Cassatt often painting their families. And in this case, she's using her sister Lydia as her subject. So women often did more things that were accessible to them because they had much more of a limited orbit that they were allowed to operate in. Notice in the Renoir painting of the Loge, the woman is accompanied, which was typical of upper class women. You did not go out without an escort, especially if you were unmarried. You certainly were not alone. And I joke sometimes that the guy in the Renoir painting, he might just be her escort. He might be like an uncle or a cousin, sent to accompany her. So of course he's looking around and seeing what fancy ladies are in the crowd. Now notice Lydia. Who is with Lydia? Nobody. And this was painted by a woman. So I always think, is this a little bit of Cassatt kind of speaking towards why do women have to have this, escort with them? Why can't we govern our own affairs? She places her sister in a very active role, you'll notice. She looks more realistic than the woman in Renoir's painting. She looks very self-assured of her space and of her, surroundings. Behind her is a mirror, so we get reflected back to us, everyone looking at her, and her, in a sense, looking at them, but we get to see it in the mirror. I love that use of the mirror. I think it's really, really brilliant for an Impressionist work about seeing and being seen. And then at the opera, you'll notice the woman is looking out with her opera glasses, and the man behind her is looking at her, right? So, but Cassatt, she was very interested in like the position of women and how to show them right in society. And I also want to show you Manet. As I mentioned, Manet would confuse you and become an Impressionist. So sorry, but that's how it is. And this is his famous bar at the Folies Bergère, a very written about and analyzed painting, because no one's really quite sure what's going on here. And Manet becomes an Impressionist, but I always think in my mind he never quite leaves his realist subjects behind. There's always kind of a deeper feeling to Manet's work in the Impressionist vein, at least when I look at it. Renoir can be fluffy and bourgeois. Monet's painting haystacks, right? Manet seems to be saying something more. So again, I don't think he ever shakes free of his realist urges about subject matter. But he does go more technique-wise into the Impressionist camp and begins to hang out with them. So you'll notice, again, this sort of unfinished backgrounds and such to this piece. Now, why is this piece talked about so much? Why is it written about so much? There's different conflicting theories on what's going on. The first theory is you're looking at two distinctly different barmaids. The one facing us is one woman. The one in the back is another serving another client. The second theory is that the mirror is behind her reflecting herself. However, If you really start to look at the painting, this doesn't quite add up, does it? Not exactly. So many people are like, is it a mirror? I don't know about that. The third theory, the one I like because I like these kind of theories, is that the woman in the back is her real self. It's the person who is going through the motions, serving the clients. And I've never been a bartender, but I've known a lot in my day. And it's a pretty hard job, in a lot of ways. It can be thankless. You're dealing with drunk people who sometimes, get a little crazy, don't want to go home, right? The famous line at the end of the night at the bar, right? You you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here, right? But not everybody wants to hear that. So the woman in the back, maybe that's the real her, and the woman who faces us, that's her in her mind. Where in her mind she's like, oh my God, will my shift ever end? These obnoxious drunk people, right? And I love these kind of theories that perhaps Manet was speaking to the reality of her work and then the internal nature of her work, her feelings about it, let's say. And as a realist, that he used to be, that makes some sense to me. Look at the Stonebreakers. It's all about you could be doing this job for the rest of your life, right? From youth to old age. So I put a little bit of stock in, maybe this is what Manet was trying to say with this painting. But again, it's hotly debated, what's going on in this work as far as the subject matter is concerned. I'll leave it up to you to decide. Is it two girls, right? Is it, a mirror reflecting the one woman from the other? Or is it one woman and then the woman in her mind? Who's to say? I don't know. And by the way, the Folies Bergère, you can actually spot what the Folies Bergère was known for as an entertainment venue. If you look in the top left of the painting, you'll see a pair of feet kind of hanging down that are on a trapeze. So the Folies Bergère was actually known for having a circus that kind of performed over the heads of the people below. That was their entertainment. Because most of the moulins and the bars of this time had some kind of signature entertainment, right? Can dancers, right? Different musical acts or different actresses, the circus here. It probably was a fabulous time to go out to the clubs, let me tell you, this time in France, for sure. A very, very social time period. And the final artist I'm going to show you is Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, here's the thing. People argue about Toulouse-Lautrec, like, is he an impressionist or is he a post-impressionist? And there's good arguments for both sides of this, right? But I lump him with impressionists because those are the people he spent his time with. We know that he hung around with impressionists and was painting more in their time period than post-impressionism. He wasn't hanging out with Gauguin and Van Gogh. So for me, I kind of lump him with his friends. So I say he is an impressionist. Other people say the use of color that he employs is a much more post-impressionist look, because you'll see in a minute in the next lecture that post-impressionists use color very emotionally, very strongly. So there is a point of contention amongst art historians about placing Toulouse-Lautrec, just to be very clear. I love Toulouse-Lautrec. And the reason why I like him so much is because his story is very interesting. He had tuberculosis as a child, and it stunted his growth. You can actually see him in the painting. He's in the painting. You see the little short guy kind of framed by the taller man in the back? So he's very, very short. And he writes in his journals about how he always felt kind of like a monster or otherworldly, or, he was picked on and kind of bothered for his short stature. And so when he does start to paint, he expresses an interest in what he calls the seediness or the underbelly of Paris at this time, that he liked the unusual people. So where Renoir, to me, paints the bourgeois as happy, go lucky, moneyed, Toulouse-Lautrec goes the other route, where he shows you people at these cafes and these moulins, kind of seedy, not to be trusted, sad, kind of depressed. Because I look at this scene he gives us, and these are not happy people. They all look like they're just staring at each other. There's no warmth. There's no, happiness. It just feels very alienated. So he seemed to want to express to us another side of Paris, right, at this time. There's eerie stuff in the work, the woman with the green face right up to the frame. The way he starts to use space, and I always tell my students, Abstraction didn't come out of nowhere, right? Cubism, those movements that didn't come out of anywhere, it had to develop. If you really think about how the space is starting to be taken apart in this work, there's a very cubist kind of element, that starts to emerge here. The use of space is a little unusual. Again, we're starting to see some of these other modern elements creep in, just like we saw like the hints of Impressionism in like Turner back in Romanticism. So the composition is kind of strange as well. But there's this oddity, this strangeness that we feel kind of hovering right over the scene, that Toulouse-Lautrec really enjoyed. The Moulin Rouge, of course, is a very famous Moulin of the time, probably the most famous. They were known for their can-can dancers. So again, this was a typical place where people went and hung out and spent their time. But again, I think he's trying to show you, the things that are kind of unsavory. The green face, for instance, the green face was linked to drinking absinthe. Absinthe was a favorite beverage of the time, and back in the day, it basically made people hallucinate because it had wormwood in it. They called it the Green Fairy. And if you've ever seen the movie Moulin Rouge, right? Kylie Minogue, the pop singer, is in that movie as the Green Fairy after the guys drink absinthe and start to trip. She shows up as the Green Fairy, but it's an allusion to absinthe and hallucination and all these kind of things. So the green face of the woman in the Moulin Rouge piece, people say it could be like addressing the absinthe drinking, and that's why all the people at the table look really out of it, because they are really out of it. Some people also talk about the green face could be an allusion to syphilis, because we know that sexually transmitted diseases were rampant at this time in France due to the brothels that were running. Even though they were state-run and organized, there was a lot of STDs, primarily syphilis, coming out of the brothels. And syphilis at that time was incurable. So it made you go crazy, and it gave you like these face pustules, and it was just a terrible affliction. So many people, talk about it almost looks like she's wearing a mask in the painting. And, if you took the mask away, which you have these syphilis marks on her face and stuff. So, again, the kind of seedy underbelly is what he tried to kind of look into. But I often say Toulouse-Lautrec actually was a pretty smart painter, because, just artist in general, because he knew that to keep himself afloat monetarily, that he had to have like real business. I think, again, the art for art's sake thing afflicted a lot of people at this time. If you look at realists and impressionist painters, a lot of them, they were painting art for art's sake. They weren't concerning themselves as much by who was paying them. So you can imagine this is when the starving artist idea gets born. And we joke that, the ones who had money, like, Manet, they could dodge this. But someone like Toulouse-Lautrec knew he had to be a working artist as well. So he actually did ads in advertisements and, different theater posters and different things. So this is some of the work he did for Jean Avril, who was a famous can-can dancer and entertainer and singer of the time, where he would do these posters, right, advertising her and her can-can dancers. And this is the way he made his money, really. And then the piece that I showed you of the Moulin Rouge, you'll actually notice that was done on cardboard with pastels. So it's like materials that he got out of the trash and like cheap pastels. So his, more finished work was more of his, again, advertising work. So he was very practical about the situation, and that may have come from him feeling like, life wasn't very fair, like he didn't have an idealistic view on life, right? He had, you had to protect yourself, you had to do what's necessary. Final thing I want to mention is the influence of Japan in its style on Impressionist and Post-Impressionist work. This is what we call Japonism, or the Japanese style. And what it is printmaking from Japan coming through trade to Europe. And that impact is most heavily seen stylistically in the Impressionist period. On the left, you have a traditional Japanese print by Hiroshige, a very, very well-known printmaker from Japan. And then you'll notice that Van Gogh, what he did was like transpose the subject and the style into a post-impressionist painting. And so a lot of the artists, like Mary Cassatt and Degas and others, they were using the Japanese style as an influence right on their paintings. So these aren't prints. If you look at the Japanese works, they're actually prints. These are usually typically paintings, but notice that they mimic the printmaking style, where they'll have this very flat 2D quality, very decorative use of color and pattern. And I'd mentioned before that women tended to focus on the family a lot. So you'll see in Cassatt's Maternal Caress, again, this was a subject that would have been more available to her to create. This is Degas, and many people look at some of his pastels like this one and say, there's obvious Japonism influences, right? Here are some one-to-one side-by-sides where Degas, a woman kind of putting her hair up, and then a Japanese print of a woman putting her hair up. Or again, the Degas dancers, and then samurais and sumo wrestlers right from Japan. So again, Japonism is an interesting thing to consider as far as style, subject matter, use of color in people like Degas and Cassatt's works, especially in the Impressionist period, and then Van Gogh within the Post-Impressionist period.